Man, this tire is just loving life. I am not confident this tire is going to survive this project. All right, so here's the 350 that I planned on putting in the 280. The specs on it really don't matter because probably the single biggest roadblock I've had in this project, apart from not being able to get the original engine to work right, was when I found out that I was not able to use this engine in this car the way I wanted to. What I didn't realize is there was a change from 1985 to 1986. This block is a 76. The crank presumably is also a 76. And this is a two-piece rear main seal. And in 1986, they went to a one-piece rear main seal. And what I quickly realized is this pilot here is way too small to fit over this register. Also, this bolt pattern here is way smaller than this bolt pattern here. So that's the difference. If you have a flywheel, flex plate, whatever, you have to match it for the generation of crank, whether it's the two-piece rear main or the two-piece seal or the one-piece seal, because that changes this whole thing right here on the crank, this whole flange and pilot. Now, this is the 380,000 mile 305 out of the Silverado. So it's a 1992, so we're after 1985. And so it has the one-piece rear main. So you can see we have this big piece here that we didn't have on the 85 and older block. The thing that's also kind of harder to tell is this pilot here is smaller, this bolt pattern is smaller. And you can see the one-piece seal that goes all the way around. So I'm going to use the 0305 for mock-up. I can put the flywheel on here, and then I can figure out how the clutch is going to go together. So that's what we're going to get into now. All right, that answers the question of when does the bell housing go on? The bell housing has to go on first without the transmission. Otherwise, you can't get the pivot arm on. So I guess that's why this is mounted here the way it is, because you have to fish the pivot arm in there, get all of this lined up, get this slipped over onto the throwout bearing, and then you can dork around with it and hopefully eventually the threads take. So the reason all of this is all kinds of jacked up is because the slave cylinder mounts right here and pushes this way. On most transmissions, the slave cylinder is mounted the opposite way and pushes this way against the pivot arm. So the benefit of that is if you're pushing this way, you're pushing the pivot arm into the pivot ball, which means it shouldn't ever come off. And if you push this way, the pivot ball pushes that way. By default, the clutch arm is going to push this way, and so you're going to push basically you're trying to push the pressure plate into the engine. So the other benefit of that is the throwout bearing doesn't actually have to be really connected to anything. It just has to be in there where it can push on the pressure plate. This setup is the opposite. Because the slave cylinder pushes here, it puts the pivot ball under tension, which is why it had the crazy wear that it did. And instead of the throwout bearing being pushed into the pressure plate, the throwout bearing is actually pulled away from the pressure plate, which is probably not as strong of a style. But anyways, the other side effect of it having to pull on the throwout bearing is that this arm has to be clipped onto the bearing, which makes all of this really hard to get on. You can't just pop it on there because it has to be locked in to the throwout bearing. The other deal is it requires a special flywheel because you're putting all that pulling force on the flywheel. I guess with a regular flywheel, you run the risk of eventually blowing the flywheel to pieces by pulling on it like that. So that's why this flywheel is special, and it's actually really, really thick. It's way thicker than a regular flywheel. So I ended up putting the car together with the Nissan master cylinder and the Corvette slave cylinder, and the clutch would not release. So this is what I ended up having to do to figure out a slave cylinder that would work. And it's a lot of math. I had to rely heavily on my degree in mechanical engineering to figure this out. It's a joke. This really wasn't, I mean, this is actually pretty, there's a lot written here, but this is pretty simple. There's not a whole lot going on. You just have to keep everything straight. So I expected that the clutch wasn't going to work because the Corvette slave cylinder has a bore of 27 millimeters, which translates to 1.063 inches. And the 280ZX slave cylinder has a bore of 17.5 millimeters, which translates to 0.69 inches. So the factory 280 slave cylinder made to work with that master cylinder is a lot smaller than the Corvette one. So with the Corvette slave cylinder, I had a lot more mechanical advantage, but the consequence of that is it wasn't moving the piston as far in the slave cylinder, and it wasn't far enough to actually disengage the clutch. So just some basic things to go over here before we get rolling with this. Volume of a cylinder, pi, the radius of the cylinder squared times the height, or in this case, it's going to be, the height is going to be replaced with the stroke of the cylinder or whatever is moving. Bore is going to equal diameter, which is going to equal 2 times the radius. So we're good there. And because this is a hydraulic system, hydraulic fluids don't compress. So the volume of whatever comes out of the master cylinder is going to equal the volume of whatever enters the slave cylinder. So that is what that whole thing is saying. So looking at the specs here, the 280ZX master cylinder, the bore, again, is 0.63 inches. That comes out to a radius of 0.315 inches. Just divide the bore by 2. The problem, don't know the stroke. The Corvette slave cylinder, again, has the bore of 1.06 inches. Divide that by 2 to get the radius of 0.53 inches. So we have a bit of a problem here. If we were going to try and use this equation here to get some information, we have one equation and 2 unknowns. That's not solvable. We need another piece of information. So since I had everything assembled in order to realize that it didn't work, I used, since the clutch of this transmission can be installed on the engine complete and functional without the transmission actually being in place, what I did is I put a straight edge across the bell housing and I measured the throw of the throwout bearing. So the actual throw of the throwout bearing was 0.14 inches. That is actually what I measured. So if you can't leave the bell housing on the block with the clutch intact in order to measure that, then you're gonna have to get a little more creative on how you measure that. You might have to somehow rig something up with the slave cylinder detached from the bell housing and then somehow have a way of measuring it. I don't know, that would be kind of challenging. Thankfully, I didn't have to mess with that. So another an assumption we're gonna have to make here, or that I had to make here, was where the pivot was in the clutch fork, the pivot arm, whatever you want to call it. So I just kind of eyeballed it as best I could with the tape measure, and it looked like the pivot was centered in the clutch fork. That's important because if this pivot is biased one way or the other, then your throw at the bearing is not going to equal your stroke at the slave cylinder. So I eyeballed it and it looked centered to me. So I just made the assumption that the throw at the bearing was going to equal the stroke at the slave cylinder. If it wasn't the case, what I would have done is, you can see these little dotted lines here. So you end up with you can draw a little right triangle on either side. Use the similar triangle rules, set up a nice little proportion. You'll have the stroke of the slave cylinder over, well, you can set it up a little bit differently. It should pretty much work out the same, but the way I did it is stroke of the slave cylinder over the length of the clutch fork going to the slave cylinder, and then the stroke at the bearing times the length of the clutch fork going to the bearing. And the way proportion works is really nice. You just multiply diagonal, divide by the third number, and that will give you the fourth number if everything is proportional. In this case, we have similar triangles, they should be proportional. So that would come out to the stroke at the slave cylinder is going to equal the length of the fork on the slave cylinder side times the stroke of the bearing that you need, divided by the length of the clutch fork on the bearing side. So in my case, that did work. I mean, I plugged my numbers in and I got the same stroke on either end. But if the pivot is off-centered, then you're going to have to do something like that in order to figure it out. Again, I'm assuming I'm doing all this right. I didn't actually have to, put that to the test. Anywho, so then we're going to come down here. So now that we have a known stroke of the slave cylinder, we can figure out the volume. So the volume of the slave cylinder for the Corvette, again, pi r squared times the stroke. So pi, so that's the stroke of the Corvette slave cylinder. Sorry, that's the radius squared of the slave cylinder. So 0.53, we're going to square it, times the stroke that we measured, gives us this volume, 0.124 inches cubed. That is the volume of fluid that was pumped into the Corvette slave cylinder. So since this is a hydraulic system, we know our volumes have to be the same between the master cylinder. Whatever leaves the master cylinder has to enter the slave cylinder. So the volume of fluid that left the master cylinder also has to equal 0.124 inches cubed. So now we have to do a little bit of guessing. So I just picked a slave cylinder. So the one that I picked, it had a bore of 17.53 millimeters or 0.60 inches. And if I remember right, yeah, so I picked this one. It was not the 280ZX slave cylinder, but it was made by Nissan, so it had the same bore. Gives you a radius of 0.35 or 0.345 inches. So that's the one that we're going to guess with. So instead of having to go buy this, make a bracket, install it, and then figure out if it works, we can do a little bit of math here real quick to figure out if it's going to work. So this equation here, so the volume of the master cylinder is going to equal the volume of the slave cylinder, except we don't know the stroke. So we're going to plug in our volume from the master cylinder. It's going to equal pi times our radius squared of the slave cylinder that we're experimenting with, and we don't know the stroke of it. So rearrange the equation to get this guy here. Just plug in the numbers, and what I got was the stroke for this slave cylinder is going to be 0.332 inches. That is good because per the specs I found for this ZF transmission, the required stroke at the bearing is 0.315 inches. So the stroke that we can theoretically get out of this experimental slave cylinder is going to exceed the upper bound requirement that we need for this clutch. So that meets the requirement there. So now I can justify going and buying one, making a bracket, installing it, and testing it. And what I found is yes, the clutch actually did work, and I went and measured it, and what I got was 0.35 inches. So all of this math, and really all this math and the assumptions I had to make, because assumptions and measurements is where you're going to end up getting a whole lot of error from. But even with all of that, I was off by less than 0.02 of an inch. So yeah, you might say this looks tedious, complicated, and not worth the time and effort. but this really wasn't that much time and effort, and it meant that the first slave cylinder I tried was the one that worked. Just a few afterthoughts I had. So when you're measuring the clutch fork, I went ahead and measured to the center of where the slave cylinder would be pushing on the clutch fork and to the center of the bearing. That was how I ended up measuring it. Also, another thing to consider is when you're switching around slave cylinders, master cylinders, and clutches that weren't designed to work together, something else that you're gonna have to keep in mind is how that's gonna change the feel of the clutch. So for example, whenever I had the 280 master cylinder and the larger Corvette slave cylinder, the clutch pedal was really, really light because the added difference between the two effectively gave me more mechanical advantage over the clutch. So it made the clutch really light. It's also why it wouldn't disengage. But if you're swapping parts around, you're gonna change how the clutch feels. So now that I'm using, so that transmission was designed for this larger slave cylinder. And just for reference, the Corvette master cylinder actually has almost the same bore as the 280 master cylinder. The difference is the Corvette master cylinder has about twice the stroke of the 280 master cylinder. So that's why it works. But the Corvette clutch gives you a lot more mechanical advantage than the 280Z clutch will. So that's what I found whenever I did the Nissan slave cylinder and the 280 master cylinder. The clutch is pretty heavy. It's heavier than a normal hydraulic clutch. It's not terrible. It's definitely something I can live with. But that is just something else to keep in mind if you're swapping a bunch of parts around, that you may run into an issue where you can't use the master cylinder either because the pedal gets too heavy or something like that. And another thought that I had, so I made my measurement for the actual throw of the clutch with everything assembled because that was pretty easy to do with this transmission. I think what you might be able to do that would be easier than going through and setting all that up is I think you could potentially bolt something, a little piece of wood, piece of metal, something in place of the clutch master cylinder, and you could measure the throw of the clutch pedal. So figure out where the clutch pedal sits in its normal position with the master cylinder installed. Remove the master cylinder, bolt some other piece of metal in place that goes all the way through the firewall, and then depress the clutch pedal and take a measurement of how much of your measuring rod pokes through the firewall. Because I think that would be a pretty decent way of doing that, and that would give you your stroke of your master cylinder, which would give you your volume, and then you can go through and you can just skip right down to here. But anyways, gonna be done with the math for now. All right, so I'm working on this mount for the slave cylinder. I don't know if this slave cylinder is gonna work or not, so I'm trying to keep the effort I'm putting in this to a minimum in case it doesn't work out. But I'm trying to put this together in a smarter way where instead of trying to rig up all these pieces individually where they need to be, what's really important is that both of these brackets mount up to the slave cylinder correctly. So to try and ensure that they do that, I've just clamped them to the slave cylinder, so that takes any real guesswork out of it. So I have them attached to the slave cylinder pretty much where I want them. So that way I can go tack these brackets on and then get the whole thing welded up without worrying about stuff moving around or not ending up where it's supposed to be. Once that's done, then I can go ahead and mark and drill the holes, and it shouldn't be a big deal. And I also put a little Sharpie mark there to indicate which way is up whenever this is mounted in the car, because I want to make sure that the bleed screw is mounted at the top of the slave cylinder and not at the bottom like how the original Corvette garbage was. And then you can see a little scribe mark right there. There's 4 of those, and that's how I'm centering this over the center pilot hole in the bracket. And I just used a dial caliper for that. I just found the width the outer width of the cylinder, divided that by 2, centered one of the jaws over the center of the pilot hole, and then scratched 4 little marks to give me something to line up against. So now I'll go ahead and get it welded up. Get a look at these real quick before they go back in the car. So I have the boot back on the slave cylinder, and this rod here is the one that I custom turned on the drill press. Got the 4-man slave going. It's actually part of the Corvette one that I cut down, and I did some real scientific measuring. I basically just put the rod in here, compressed it as much as I could with the bracket bolted to the slave cylinder, compressed it all the way to where I bottomed out in this, and then measured. It has about two finger widths, and so I took that amount off of the push rod, and it worked. So there's that. And then I got the bracket all painted up here, and I also hogged out the center of it. I had to use the plasma cutter to widen that hole, and it is there so that the boot will fit through, because I want to have the boot on this guy. So this should be ready to go in there. I got my little washer spacers good to go, so we can put it in the car so we can get the transmission back in it. Man, what an ordeal it was to get this little clutch line. I needed this clutch line to go with this slave cylinder, but any place local to me had this for north of $26, which seemed pretty excessive. I think it was Amazon had this Dorman part for like $11 or $12. So I ordered one, and it showed up in the, well, I should say the box it showed up in was just the cheap little Dorman part box, real thin cardboard. Wasn't taped up at all, so both ends of the box were blown out, and there was no line. So they sent me another one, and the exact same thing happened. So I ordered one through Rock Auto, which was this guy here, and it was supposed to come with copper washers, but it didn't come with any washers. So I needed to get some copper washers, and thankfully I found this little set kicking around the garage, because any place local to me is selling a 10mm copper washer for $2.50 to $3 a piece, which is just absolute highway robbery. So quite the fiasco, but now that I have this line, I can get that put together, and we can see if this has a chance of working. It would just kill you to stay clean, wouldn't it? Yep. This is the line for the clutch that I mocked up using just the original clutch line from the car. It worked okay. I wasn't real happy with it though, mostly just because of this union here in the middle. I didn't like having that, just because I was afraid if this thing flexed around a little bit that it might try and break the flares off, because these newer tube nuts, hard to tell, but they really don't support the flare very well, in my opinion. They're not a tight fit at all to the tube. It's very, very loose. So I didn't care for that. So I just made up a new hard line out of a single piece. Spent probably an hour messing with it, but I'm actually pretty pleased with it. So we'll go ahead and put this on, and then got to figure out how to mount that end of it. Here's the upper end of the clutch line installed. Ties in there. Ended up with this weird looped low section, just because that was the only way I could bend it up with the tube bender that I have. Used a factory rubber isolating clamp there, just had to space it off the firewall. And down there, I need to put a little rubber isolator around the line just so it doesn't bump into the floor of the car. But up here, it looks pretty good. And here's the line under the car. I'm pretty pleased with how all this actually turned out. So, clamped here, obviously. And the reason that the hard line has to do this kind of weird bend in it is I didn't want to get the rubber line to do that, because I was trying to keep the rubber line as high as I could so that it's away from the exhaust. That's going to have to be running through here somewhere. So there you can see the rubber line, which I mounted all this before I realized the motor needed to go forward. So the line the line is not tight by any stretch. I mean, you can see it's still got a bunch of play in it. But I should have made sure all that was squared away before I welded this bracket. And this bracket is actually the original one for the original clutch line that would have been over there. Just sawzalled it off, brought it over here, welded it in place. It had the same whatever mounting fixture for this newer hydraulic line. So I felt like that was a pretty pro way of mounting that. It has the factory clip in there. I just had to trim the corner of it. Hopefully somewhere on there is the part number in case future me ever has to figure it out. You can see I got the bracket all painted and nice. So these aren't the bolts that are going to be here. These are just here for now. I need shorter ones with the lock nut. And then up here is the bleed screw. So with the bleed screw being at the top, you actually bleed this thing really easy. And so I've got the transmission in gear, so we can see this real quick. So clutch in. So I'm pretty pleased with that. I think that's a wrap on that. I'm going to call it good.